If you look around your room and see evidence of 5 different lives you almost lived, a camera you swore you'd master, a language app you opened obsessively for 2 months, a half-written business plan, resistance bands gathering dust, books from completely different fields stacked on the same shelf, you probably feel a very specific kind of quiet embarrassment. It's not loud shame. It's the kind that hums in the background, the kind that makes you hesitate when someone asks what you do. Society has a label for you: unfocused, indecisive, flaky, maybe even unserious. You're told that if you had discipline, you'd pick one thing and commit, that if you were truly talented, you'd stop wandering. So you internalize it. You start to believe something is wrong with you. You tell yourself you're behind because you can't seem to walk in a straight line. You might even repeat that old phrase to yourself: jack of all trades, master none, as if it explains everything. But that phrase was never meant to be a sentence. It was a warning taken out of context, and it has kept people like you apologizing for a mind that was never built to move in one direction. Psychology offers a very different explanation for this pattern. What you experience as distraction is not a flaw. It's a signal. It's a behavior and nervous system that is constantly scanning for connections. You're not failing to specialize. You're responding to complexity. Beneath the surface, something else is forming, a structure that doesn't look impressive early on, but becomes almost unfair later. You are slowly assembling what researchers sometimes call an M-shaped capability profile. Multiple depths, multiple identities, connected by curiosity instead of confined by a single title. While the world pressures you to narrow your focus, your brain is preparing you for a future where narrow focus breaks first. Before we unpack why this pattern exists and why it's becoming more valuable every year, pause for a moment and notice where you're watching from. And if this kind of quiet psychology feels like it's describing your inner life a little too accurately, you already know where to find more of it after. To understand why this tension follows you everywhere, you have to understand the environment you were trained for. For most of the last century, success followed a very specific shape. One line, one climb. You chose profession early, went deep, and stayed there. It was an I-shaped world. Predictable, stable. The rules barely changed. If you repeated the same motions long enough, mastery arrived on schedule. This worked because the environment was kind, like chess with fixed rules or golf on a familiar course. Practice accumulated cleanly, experience stacked neatly. But you don't live in that world anymore. And some part of you knows it, even if you've never put words to it. The modern world is a wicked environment. The rules shift mid-game. Technologies replace themselves. Entire careers appear and disappear within a decade. In a wicked environment, specialization becomes fragile. When the context changes, the specialist loses leverage. Their depth becomes a narrow tunnel instead of a foundation. Your mind senses this instability instinctively. So instead of going deeper, it goes wider. One year you're absorbed in design and storytelling. The next, you're learning about finance, physiology, or systems. To someone watching from the outside, this looks like chaos, like restlessness, like an inability to commit. But what you're actually doing is mapping terrain. You're collecting perspectives. You're building range. This is where psychology introduces a concept most people never hear about, but you live inside of every day. It's called far transfer. Specialists rely on near transfer. They solve familiar problems with familiar tools. Same patterns, same context, same logic, but far transfer works differently. It's when you take an idea from one domain and apply it somewhere it doesn't obviously belong. This is how real innovation happens. This is why people with nonlinear backgrounds often see solutions others miss. Imagine someone who worked in logistics before moving into healthcare, or a programmer who studied music deeply before touching code. The surface skills don't overlap, but the underlying structures do. Rhythm becomes systems thinking. Harmony becomes coordination. Constraints become creativity. What looks unrelated is quietly reinforcing everything else. You feel like an imposter because you don't dominate a single category. But your value was never meant to come from domination. It comes from synthesis. You combine, you connect, you translate, Where others see silos, you see bridges. This is relieving to hear, almost intoxicating. For a moment, the self-criticism eases. You recognize yourself in the description, but then the anxiety creeps back in, because understanding doesn't erase the pressure of time. You still watch peers climb linear ladders. Titles accumulate, salaries grow, and you feel like you're looping sideways while everyone else moves forward. That gap creates exhaustion, not because you're lazy, but because you're measuring yourself with the wrong geometry. You've been told to picture growth as a straight ascent, or maybe a T-shape, broad knowledge with one deep specialty. But neither of those models fit you. Your growth doesn't look like a line or a single pillar. It looks like an M, multiple verticals, separate depths, connected by a horizontal thread of curiosity and pattern recognition. The mistake people make is trying to build the entire M at once. They try to master everything simultaneously. That's when burnout hits. That's when progress stalls. The people who actually thrive with this structure understand something subtle. They work in seasons. Serial mastery is the quiet discipline behind the M-shaped life. You don't abandon interests. You complete phases. One chapter gets your full attention while others rest. Later, they return stronger because they're informed by everything that came after. You might spend years immersed in one field, not because it's a final answer, but because it's the pillar you're building right now. Later, another pillar rises. Over time, they begin to connect, not by force, but by accumulation. There's a story of someone who didn't make peace with this pattern until their 50s. For decades, they felt split, technology on one side, creative work on the other. Each choice felt like a betrayal of the other half. Eventually, they stopped trying to collapse themselves into one identity. They let one pillar support stability, income, structure, and they protected space for the others without demanding immediate results. They declined promotions that would consume their energy. They designed a life with enough margin to think. Years later, those separate interests fused naturally into something no single path could have produced. It wasn't wasted time. It was delayed coherence. So stop apologizing for the paths you didn't finish. Those weren't failures. They were foundations poured early. They taught you how to learn, how to begin, how to see patterns across difference. You were never meant to be reduced to one label. You were meant to operate between worlds, to move ideas across borders others don't cross. If this description feels uncomfortably accurate, you're not alone. And if you're ready to stop forcing yourself into a shape that never fit, leave a heart in the comments. It means you see the pattern now. And if you want to go deeper into how to structure your seasons without burning out, you already know where to go next.